Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Kupka. I'm here with Pure Earth and the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution. Hope you all can see me here. We are delighted to have so many people attending our first GAP info session, and we really look forward to your participation and your feedback as to how this platform works. We are extremely excited to have John Keith here with us this morning. He's a longtime friend of Pure Earth and an expert on all things contaminated sites, especially related to lead remediation. So we're really excited to have him here this morning. John is an environmental engineer. He's got more than 40 years of experience, both in the private sector, working with government agencies as well as nonprofit. He's been in charge of many remediation projects in the U.S. and throughout the world, including for Pure Earth. In 2010, he was leading our project in Zamfara, Nigeria, where over 400 children had died from severe lead contamination. So he's just got some incredible experience from the field, and we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation, John. So over to you, and I will disappear from the camera now. Thank you much. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Looking forward to the presentation and discussion.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. This discussion is going to be about lead contamination remediation. There are many steps in the process of dealing with a contaminated site, as I will discuss, but this is going to be focused on the remediation step, the actual cleanup of sites, what technologies are available and usable in different situations to clean up lead contamination remediation. Now, if I can. Okay. Lead contamination, as most of you probably know, is what we in Blacksmith or Pure Earth have found to be the #1 contaminant around the planet for site contamination. This slide shows the major types of contamination sources that we've found in our evaluation of over 3,000 sites. And right up there on the top is used lead acid battery recycling and lead smelting. Lead also shows up as a key contaminant in artisanal crafts, such as dyeing and particularly ceramics. And then there's the abandoned sites from mining, used lead acid battery, and other sources that are also important in lead contamination. So this is a major issue globally. We're going to have to figure out how to move these things forward. So the next slide, I'm just going to go through a brief review about lead. If you've worked with lead, you probably know a lot of this, but it's useful to keep it in mind. We estimate that over 25 million people's health are impacted by lead contamination, the #1 public health risk from contaminated sites. Lead is an element, it doesn't degrade. The exposures continue long after the source is gone, and this lack of degradation also limits the types of remediation technologies that can be used. In particular, it limits the biological type processes. The health impacts occur at low soil concentrations below what you can see. So contaminated soil usually looks like everything else, and if you can see it, it's really bad. This is a real problem in the field, communicating the risks of lead to communities because they can't see it, but it's still bad. In the U.S., EPA has set their standard for residential soils at 400 milligrams per kilogram. Other countries have lower acceptable standards, and the U.S. EPA is considering lowering that standard because it is actually quite conservatively high. So it's not unusual for us to encounter lead contamination standards as low as 100 milligrams per kilogram in other countries. Major sources, I mentioned a few of them already. Mines, smelters, use lead acid batteries, and use in ceramic. That probably accounts for about 90% of the lead or more of the contamination around the world. And keep in mind the migration routes. Obviously, there's wind, surface runoff. Lead is heavy, so it tends not to go too far down drainage ditches and streams. But in flood situations, lead can effectively spread over a very wide area from its source location. Uh, so we do pay a lot of attention to water spreading. We find, particularly we found this in a study in Dang Mai, Vietnam, that workers in lead shops in the smelter areas can be a major source of introduction of lead into a community and into their own homes. Lead gets on their clothing, their shoes, on their feet, uh, and this can be a significant, very significant source, as can tires. We also find that people move lead to contaminated soils deliberately. Either they're building something new and they're moving piles of dirt around, or in the case that we saw in Zamfara, Nigeria, the lead tailings from the mining activities that they were doing were very good to walk on, and the people there mostly walk barefoot. Uh, so they deliberately moved this material into their homes because it was so nice to walk on. So there's lots of ways that lead can get spread around a community. And finally, on the lead introduction, the exposure routes, well, I'll talk about health impacts as well, but the exposure routes, ingestion is by far the most important exposure route. Uh, Children eating soil, chewing their fingernails, licking their hands, and keep in mind that inhalation of dust generally is an ingestion route. You inhale dust if it's larger than 4 microns. Uh, it gets caught in the nose and throat, and you cough it up and swallow it, and that becomes ingestion. Uh, Dermal contact is generally not a major route, uh, and contaminated food is generally not a major route if people wash the food before eating it. The biggest concern is usually dust on food. We keep in mind that lead is taken into roots and particularly into root plants, potatoes, cassava, things like that. Lead will come into the roots. At every site we have ever worked at, we always get a question about drinking water. The people are very concerned about their drinking water and lead contamination, and we always test water if there's any drinking water, any wells that are near a contaminated site. And we generally found that is not a major pathway into the body, primarily because inorganic lead it has a very low solubility and doesn't reach concentrations of concern. And lastly, a reminder of the exposure of the health effects of lead. Children are the most sensitive, particularly young children under the age of 5. Their small bodies result in greater impact proportionally. They also eat more dirt. They play in it, and their neurological development is in progress. And so you see a much greater impact on children, and that is we generally are striving to protect most, and that is where the health monitoring is focused on, blood testing of children to see their concentration of lead in their blood. Reminder that the impact of lead that is most well known and is generally of most concern is the loss of cognitive function, the loss of intelligence. That this gets progressively worse as levels increase and is irreversible when young children are exposed to lead. So that's the introduction to lead. This discussion is going to focus on remediation. As I said earlier, there's many activities that you need to do to address a contaminated site. You need to find it, you need to investigate it and do a risk evaluation, then you do a remediation, and we can't leave out the health impact amelioration. That is, if people's health are impacted, then they need medical care. That notably in lead contamination means chelation therapy. And in all stages, almost all stages of addressing a site, you need to keep in mind that you need to be engaging stakeholders and doing public education. Within the remediation portion of the work, there's a variety of steps: detailed site assessment, evaluation of alternatives, design of the actual remediations, funding, implementation, post-work monitoring and evaluation, and long-term site care. I'm going to focus on the management alternatives and the design of those risk remediation activities in this discussion, as opposed to looking at how you would do a detailed site assessment or talking about post-work monitoring and long-term care. At the outset, when you consider any project, there's three factors that are critical to success. You cannot leave it out. The project management is just no project gets done well without good project management. So you have organization, quality, and safety. I list here on the left a typical project organization with the director, manager, technical advisors, then the supervisors and work teams. But the bottom four items are particularly sometimes not considered. You need a stockroom manager. It's amazing in implementing these projects that I've seen supplies walk away. It's amazing how supplies grow legs and disappear. You need somebody to manage the supplies and stockroom, because they will. That's an issue. You also need a full-time safety officer. In a lot of the countries that we work in, they're not used to using good personal protection equipment and respiratory protection, and you need somebody to enforce the rules, frankly, to make sure that you are protecting people. Quality is obviously very important. You don't know whether you're doing good work unless you've got good practices, and whether it's regarding to sampling in laboratory, field records, but particularly work review and oversight, so somebody is actually checking up that the workers are doing what they're supposed to. And then health and safety training, of course, is necessary to protect the workers and to show our commitment to protecting the community through the protection of people who are working on it. Incidents will happen, so there needs to be an incident preparation plan for first aid, any other types of accidents. Now, with regard to the actual technology to remediate lead contamination, I list here that there's only 7 basic strategies to remediate lead. It's an element, can't be destroyed. Biological alternatives are largely excluded because it's an element. The list here is listed in order of risk reduction effectiveness, from lowest at the top to highest at the bottom, but keeping in mind that we often use, and almost always use, a combination of methods, because there will be different situations at any given site. And I'll be talking about each one of these strategies individually. First is administrative control, lowest effectiveness in terms of risk reduction. You're not removing anything, you're just building a fence around a site, you're keeping people out of it. It should be done where you have a contaminated site, and you can practically do this, but it is only a temporary measure. It is clearly not generally acceptable to governments that you do nothing, and it's not acceptable to communities. In practice, we've seen this done at a number of remote sites where there's likely to be little access for future use. I'll jump to, just for convenience, the most effective remediation strategy, and that's recycling. Excavate the waste and send it to a smelter. But that's only feasible economically if there's a good smelter nearby and you have very high concentration material that you can identify and segregate from low concentration materials. And that means typically something over 100,000 milligrams per kilogram concentration. It varies by smelter, but you need really high concentration waste. In most of our contamination at most of the sites is well below the level that you can be effectively recycled. And I have a note on the bottom here about phytoremediation because I've been asked about that a number of times. But recognize that because lead doesn't degrade, if you do phytoremediation, plants, trees, other can be used to take lead out of soil. It will accumulate in the roots and the wood. But then what? It's still there. And so it's generally not considered a real option. Next, in terms of risk reduction effectiveness, is stabilization. This may mean encapsulating material in concrete at the site, using it in roads and for building blocks. It may mean mixing in a variety of stabilizing chemicals. There's a variety of commercial materials available. The effectiveness of mixing for stabilization chemicals is the critical parameter. You need to get the right formula and have very thorough mixing. Then you compact and provide good drainage. This is one of the lower cost alternatives, and it's appropriate where you have no feasible way to remove the material from a village or contaminated site, or for remote sites. This is generally most often used in combination with one of the other technologies. The next, in terms of risk reduction effectiveness, is encapsulation in place. Describe the process here. We clear and level the land. You lay down a textile so that there's a marker of what between the dirty and clean layers. Cover the soil with the area with clean soil or gravel, 15 centimeters or more. Compact, plant grass. Provide for good drainage to prevent erosion, and perhaps pave the areas that are of frequent use or where erosion is of major concern. This is a strategy that Pure Earth has found highly effective, both in terms of reduction of risk and lower cost. It's appropriate where you really don't have any alternatives for removal of the material. It's also appropriate where you have simply too much to remove, such as a tailing pile. I'm going to talk about this a little further on the next several slides. This was to show an example of where we implemented this in Dang Mai, Vietnam, and show how this was done. This was a very successful remediation that we have completed last year, or 2 years ago, in 2015. A village of around 2,600 people. It was a ULAB, used lead acid battery recycling center. Very high concentrations of lead in the soil, 2,000 to over 20,000, and children with lead levels, particularly 30 to over 60 micrograms per deciliter. We had no place to take the soil. There were no landfills nearby. Had very high groundwater tables, as you can see in the picture. Where the groundwater was in the village. We couldn't build an on-site landfill, so we basically had to encapsulate in place. And the focus was on where children are most exposed, patios and gardens. So what did we do? We first mapped the area. This is a map, actually only took 2 days. Detailed mapping of every home in the village to see where exactly the contamination was over acceptable limits. And then that was where the focus was. There were 7 key elements in the project. We note that only number 4 and 5 on this list are the actual remediation, the actual encapsulation of the soil or removal of contamination from inside houses. The others are related to the project and essential elements that you'll find in every other project, where you have to gain support, do community education, remove the actual initial source from the village, and then work on, in this case, worker hygiene and work clothes handling to prevent reintroduction of contamination. So the actual technology used was very simple. You remove the vegetation. We covered the contaminated area with, well, first we mapped every single yard. There's a typical map shown on the upper right here. That mapping was done with an XRF. You can see the picture on the lower right of that work being done. So we covered the soil with 5 centimeters of sand, covered that with geotextile, and covered geotextile with 20 centimeters of compacted clean soil. The depth of soil is a touchy issue. The greater the depth, the more you have to worry about drainage, about how this compares to surface levels in the surrounding houses, and how you're going to handle that increased elevation of the property. At the same time, you want enough depth generally so that roots can, grass roots and any other plants that they want there, have room to grow above the contaminated soil. So there are a lot of, it's not as simply just spread the dirt. It is think about where the water is going to go and how this compares to the surface area of the homes and roads in the around the site. You can see the type of worker protection that was used: boots, gloves, uniforms, and N95 dust masks. Every house that was contaminated was cleaned thoroughly using a detailed procedure that Pure Earth has developed. Multiple stage washing, including use of HEPA vacuums. Crawling in, as you see in the picture, to every space. They washed the floors, the furniture, all hard surfaces of furniture, and walls of every house that was contaminated. In this project, the roads were also highly contaminated, but that's you just can't cover them because that's not sustainable. The government came through and, after the cleaning of yards, paved all the roads, which was a major factor in success as well. So I'll move on from the encapsulation technology to purpose-built secure landfills on site. This is where you actually build a secure landfill, what we'll call an encapsulation structure, at or right near the site, building it generally to high-quality landfill standards with layers, drainage, good compaction, and the like. It's appropriate where there is first somewhere near the site, near the contaminated area, or at the contaminated area to build such a site where the geology is suitable. You can't do this if you have very shallow groundwater. And where you have a fairly flat terrain. You can't do it on a hillside, at least not very effectively. You also need very good community cooperation because you've got a lot of heavy equipment moving through when you're building this sort of structure. This slide shows 2 examples of where Pure Earth has actually built containment structures at the site. The upper left-hand corner shows a site, a containment structure that was built at a football field. The football field was a repository, a dump site for lead waste, so we just built the containment site right at that football field, and then the football field was built over top of it. You can see that it was, it looks like a regular landfill cell in construction with a liner, and then the drainage and that sort of thing was put in afterwards. The bottom three slides show the work that was done in Zamfara, Nigeria. It was 8 different villages. We built 9 landfills just outside those villages, typically about a half a kilometer away. Fortunately, there we had very competent clay, very low permeability clay. So we did not need a liner, which was very fortunate because there was no liners available in that area of Nigeria anyway. But in that site, after we got the government approvals for each site, we built the landfills, excavated the soil. You can see on the lower left the workers excavating the actual soil. They would put them into bags, load them into the trucks, and bring them over to the nearby landfill where they were deposited, as you can see in the far corner, far end of the site, the picture on the lower right, and then compacted and covered. And then all the contaminators were covered with clean soil, which is the bottom picture. Again, a very successful remediation where a project and an enormous amount of soil that was moved because we had contaminated soil throughout these 8 villages. But it's very practical. You can actually build these specific structures at or near a site, and it works very well if you have the location and the geology that works. The 5th technology is use in cement blocks, pavers, or concrete foundations, or using contaminated material in roads. The formula that you use for the mixture has to be tested, properly designed. You don't want the lead to leach out of the concrete that you're creating. Excuse me. This is a suitable technology where you've got a good quality concrete manufacturer nearby, or where you have large projects. We generally do not consider this as a suitable technology where the concrete blocks may be used in houses or schools or other places where any shedding of particles from the blocks would present a risk exposure. So generally foundations or commercial structures, industrial structures. This particular technology is the conclusion that we reached at a ULAB contaminated village in Tegal, Indonesia. That project is going forward. It is now being funded by the Danish Industrial Development Agency to the tune of several $million, and they are out for bid right now to do that remediation using this particular technology, hauling the material, the contaminated material, to a cement block manufacturer. From the final one that I'll talk about is just removal of contaminated material to an off-site, secure, hazardous waste landfill. It's obvious what you do. You dig material out, ship it off-site, bury the contaminated material in a landfill, perhaps use it as the layers of soil between other waste at a secure landfill, and then clean and cover up the original contaminated site. This is, we've found, generally the most, well, first of all, it's what governments want to do on their, very often on their first impression. Let's just take all this stuff away and put it in a landfill. Then they find out the cost for that, and it's determined that it's really too expensive for low contaminated waste. So if you're on the, whatever, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 milligram per kilogram range of lead contamination in soil, it's just too expensive to do this for large volumes of lower contaminated waste. So you reserve this for your really high volume waste, high level contamination waste that you just want out of the area. And because you don't think that encapsulation on-site or other technologies will give you the risk reduction that you really want. Any off-site disposal strategy has to consider the availability of trucks to carry things, the road conditions, how narrow are the streets in the source area, are you going through a residential area, that sort of thing. Consider the risk of spills and dust, and the fact that long distance transport significantly increase the risks of spills and accidents or diversion. In all of the projects that we do, in the design of it, you need to do, or we have done what I call a matrix analysis of the various different technologies to see which ones can work and which ones should actually be done. This is an example of a chart on of a matrix analysis where you factor in risk reduction effectiveness, cost, the project speed, sustainability, public acceptance, and any technical or logistical challenges such as narrow alleys or a lack of availability of liners, that sort of things. This table actually shows how the general ranking for each one of those different factors. We typically develop this type of matrix analysis for use not only in selection of the design of the selection of a remediation technology, but to educate the regulators, the governments, and community leaders to show how a decision was reached and why the recommended strategies we believe would be the best recommended remediation technology. I'll point out that, as most people know, there's two ways to design a project. One is where you design or decide on all the requirements of that technology, of the project, what sort of risk reduction you want, and what's the best factors that you want in the design, and then you add it all up and then you arrive at a cost. Most projects don't run that way. Most projects say, here's how much money you have, what's the best you can do for that? This sort of matrix analysis is really important in deciding what's the best you can do for the money that's likely to be available for remediation. This table shows the risk factors and the general conclusions on them for on-site remediations, where you're removing material to an off-site location. This is the matrix evaluation, the general matrix evaluation you can see for that. You can generally see that risk reduction for off-site remediation strategies is high, but the cost is high. Sustainability is high. Public loves off-site remediation. They love the contamination to be gone. But the key factor is generally the cost. So if you have if the cost is over what you can do, you really need to go back and think about the on-site remediation activities. You can still get medium or high risk reduction, but you're generally going to be in generally a lower cost regime, and you're generally in a fairly fast project speeds. So that's how we end up very often talking about remediation on-site in place. And finally, a discussion about some of the key learning that we have seen from Pure Earth projects and other projects that I've done. We believe the focus needs to be on public health protection. Protection of the environment is important, but when it comes to lead contamination, it is the public health we think should be the top priority. Cost effectiveness is always important because funds are always limited. We're looking for a sustainable solution, and we need to have local buy-in, local ownership of a project. We need to have a bias for action. We have seen a good number of sites where studies have been done, and then more studies have been done And more studies have been done. We're looking at one right now where that's the case. Uh, Unless somebody says enough studying, let's get on to and do something, nothing gets done. And that person not only has to be the Pure Earth or the project initiator, it really needs to be somebody in the community and the government. So you need to find that person who has a bias for action. We find that practical, reasonable cost solutions are usually possible. Stakeholder engagement is critical. Focus on worker safety is really important, not only because we have a moral obligation to protect the health and safety of our workers, but it shows the community that we're taking this lead contamination very seriously. All donors, or most donors, are really interested in not only remediation, but building capacity so that future remediation could be done in various different countries. But the best capacity building happens when you actually do a real project. Finally, we found that there's almost never the perfect solution to a remediation problem, a contamination problem. There's something wrong with basically every remediation strategy you can think of. It's either too expensive, or you worry about sustainability or community support, things like that. So you do need to do the matrix evaluation to arrive at a conclusion and recognize that you're going to have an imperfect solution, and people need to understand that. So hence the quote from Voltaire, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So that's it for my presentation. And Rachel, I'll hand this back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for that really informative presentation. There's clearly a lot of things to consider when doing a lead remediation project. And if anyone's like me, this is just like opening the Pandora's box of all the things that you need to consider. So thank you so much for that. We'd like to open for some short discussion. We've gone over a little bit on time because we started a bit late, but let's give at least a few minutes for discussion, and then I'll wrap up. So I do believe that, Lucy, you've got some questions that arrived for you, but if anyone has a question, please just indicate that in the chat box. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Rachel. Yes, one of the first questions I had was, some countries have different lead in soil standards. In those cases, what should I do when there are conflicting standards?
Our general answer is to follow the standard of the specific country that we're working in. So if we're working in Indonesia and their standard is 150 milligrams per kilogram in residential soil, then we try to follow that standard.
Okay. We
do find a problem sometimes where the standard of the country has been set so low, they might set something like 30 milligrams per kilogram, that it's impractical to reach it. That presents a problem, and it requires a lot of discussion. And generally, we find that we can reach some sort of compromise. But in particular, if you're using the encapsulation in place strategy, you're going to cover this material anyway. You're not removing it. If you've then the actual soil standard that you're most worried about is what are people being exposed to on the top? What's the soil level that you're covering it? So what I've generally done for example, the Zampara project, where the soil contamination was very extensive, but their standard was fairly low, we removed all the high contamination material. We actually set the number at 800 milligrams per kilogram to an offsite, to a nearby encapsulation facility, and then covered the other material, and then explained that to the government. Said this is meeting your standard because the exposure that people will be below, the soil that people will be exposed to will be below a very low standard. But so that's the basic answer. Follow the national standard. If it's really, really low, have a discussion. and recognize that when you're covering material, the people are exposed to the material, to the soil on the top. And as long as that meets the very low standard, hopefully you can have a successful discussion with the government.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have questions from anyone else at this point in time? Please note that this is not the end of the discussion. Pure Earth is always available for questions, and we're happy to pass along questions to John Keith at a later point. And I'll give a few more minutes for anyone who might have a particular question. Okay, people are shy this morning.
I did just have one more question.
Sure.
John, since you've been on a few of these projects yourself, do you guys actually get your blood tested after you do a project? Is that like a requirement of some sort?
That's actually a very good question. Workers should have their blood tested. The people that we hire to do the lead remediation work, the blood testing before and after, if feasible, you have to take into consideration, are there the appropriate laboratories and equipment nearby, or do you want to use the local field kits for blood testing? Technical advisors generally are not exposed to the higher levels because we're not digging in and getting into the into the heart of the remediation activity, and our exposure times are fairly low. That being said, yes, I had my blood tested before and after I went to Zamfara, Nigeria, and it is a good practice if you're going to have any extensive exposure.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay.
Hey, can I jump in with a question on the local ownership and what messages seem to work? Is it just the public health and child health that works? And who do you engage with? Is it local government or also women's groups or local groups that might be more concerned with, say, children's health?
We engage definitely with all the local government, the local health department, typically the Ministry of Health for the region or government, schools, if there are any in the area. Invariably, you're dealing with schools. Very often you hold the meetings at the schools. In Dynamai, the goal was to have the public education for 100% of the villagers, and that was a series of 3 different group public education and then door-to-door education for every villager. In Zamfara, all the education was done door-to-door by public health nurses. I've generally found that the best people to do the public health education are people who know the local culture, local languages, and know how best to communicate things, and public health nurses are fantastic at doing that. So that was 100% of the people in all of those villages through door-to-door education in Zamfara. Similar projects, other projects we've done in Indonesia, elsewhere, the Dominican Republic, Senegal, Zambia, a combination of strategies. Zambia, there was, again, public health education sessions. They wanted to get over 90%. I suspect we got over 80% in Zambia, but then that was followed up with door-to-door education as well.
Thanks, John. I have another question here from the audience, requesting to know a little bit more if you could speak about your experience related to groundwater remediation and when you would consider it necessary to remediate it.
Okay, as I mentioned, in every single project that I or Blacksmith has ever done related to lead, the question of groundwater contamination has come up. First, the first answer that you need to do on that is to sample the groundwater. Where there are wells nearby or water bodies nearby, ponds or streams, you sample that. You get the analysis. And you show that to the government leaders in the community and say, see, this groundwater is not contaminated. This is very low level. That's generally what happens. It has happened that you have found some more significant lead contamination. You then need to go look at your risk evaluation. What is the exposure pathway that is of most concern? When we do that, as I said kind of at the outset of my discussion, you find that the soil ingestion pathway is so dominant that spending money on the drinking water, potable water, is not money well spent. You need to focus on the soil ingestion. That can be a very difficult thing to convince communities of and governments of, particularly if in the one case that I'm thinking of on the top of my head, where the lead in the water was over drinking water standards. Eventually, basically, we said, well, this is going to be a phased project, and the first phase is going to focus on the highest risk soil, but we'll have to come back and address drinking water in the future. Remediation of groundwater can be it's a whole different set of technologies and can be very expensive and time consuming, and hence we want to focus on the greatest risk reduction that we can do rather than divert important money to a lower risk alternative. It is a challenge to convince people, it was a challenge to convince people in that one case that this is the right course of action. But we satisfied that with basically saying this is the initial phase, so it has to be a further phase to address drinking water. Most of the time, drinking water, just showing them the test results and explaining that is sufficient to resolve that issue.
Okay, thank you so much, John, for that clarification. We're getting a little bit late here in terms of time, but I want to thank everyone for attending and participating and for your excellent questions. I would like to remind you that we will be having these info sessions every other Thursday, so every 2 weeks, same time, same place, same link for GoToMeeting. We will also be having some presentations in the future, possibly in Spanish, which I think will be of interest for many of the folks on the call today. I was very pleased to see the Latin American contingency well represented here today. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, please, if you are interested in these info sessions, send an email to Lucy, L-U-C-I, at pureearth.org, so she can add you to the listserv to make sure that you're getting it directly from us. And if you have any questions for John after the fact, please also send any questions directly to Lucy. Our next session will be on February 9th. We're going to have Dr. Jack Caravanos talk about the complicated chemistry of mercury, which is quite the hot topic these days, and looking forward to that presentation. And until then, I will bid you all adieu and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for attending. Please do send any feedback as well on the GoToMeeting sessions, what works, what doesn't. If you've got it, do send it our way. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for organizing it, you guys. That was terrific. Good day to everyone.
Thank you.